So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you guys for joining us for this month's session within the Discover Tennessee History webinar series. We're really excited to have you join us today. So just a few things before we turn things over to this month's presenter. First, a few best practices. Please remember to keep your mics muted. Again, we are recording this and we'll add this to the Teaching with Primary Sources MTSU YouTube channel, where you can access all of the videos from the sessions in this series. Also, if you would rename yourself, again, it just helps us to know kind of who's joining us. And as we're talking with you guys in the chat, it's good to know exactly who we're talking to. And then also, again, we do want to make this interactive. So again, feel free to use that chat. In fact, if you want to go ahead and open that up and introduce yourselves, we would love to have you do that. And then also know that you can use the reaction buttons on the bottom of your Zoom screen. So you have all those different options to interact with us, and we hope that you will make use of those. Also know that we do have a Padlet for this series, which you can access here at this link or using this QR code. And that also contains the links for and materials from all of the sessions in this series, both from this year as well as from last school year. And we'll be adding some other things to that after today's session. So again, know that you have that as an option. So today's presentation is it's going to be given by Natalie Sweet with the Abraham Lincoln Library and Museum. And so without further ado, I will turn things over to her.
Thank you, Kara. Hello, everyone. It's great to be with you today to talk a little bit about some Civil War history in East Tennessee. As Kara said, I am Natalie Sweet. I'm at the Abraham Lincoln Library and Museum in Harrogate, Tennessee, and I'm its Program and Education Coordinator. We've actually just reopened after a 2-year-long renovation project. We hope that if you are planning to visit East Tennessee or in the area, that you will come see us, as we have lots of new galleries open. More of our collection is out on the floor, and actually for educators, particularly of those in elementary ages, we have our Lincoln Learning Lab, where kids can play and explore and find out more about primary and secondary sources. So we'll have more information about that at the end. And I'll also have information for you about how you can access our digital resources in case you are further afield or you are still not taking field trips due to the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm going to share my screen. Right. And set up our slideshow. So I hope everyone can see. Today's session is titled Beyond.
We're not seeing your screen just yet.
Oh, it's not showing the screen.
Yeah.
Okay. There we go. Hopefully it is showing now.
Yeah. Yes,
okay,
we see
great.
it now.
Thank you for that. Today's session is titled Beyond the Battles, East Tennessee Civilians Through Soldiers' Eyes. One thing that is constantly a surprise to our students, even to those located in East Tennessee, is that while many students know that Tennessee joined the Confederacy during the Civil War as the final state to join that East Tennessee actually was wishing to remain largely, or most of the population, with the United States. And so, particularly where the Abraham Lincoln Library and Museum is located in Harrogate, Tennessee, we have a great opportunity to talk to students about that fact, because our existence is actually owing to the Unionists who lived in that portion of the state. In fact, that's why we take our name. Lincoln Memorial University, which is the university where we are located, is because one of the generals of the Civil War, O.O. Howard, founded the university to the memory of Lincoln for the loyalty of those individuals in East Tennessee who he encountered during the war. But one of the problems that we encounter when we're trying to talk to students about the Civil War is that we could tell them lots about the civilian experience. We could tell them quite a bit about leadership in East Tennessee during the Civil War. We can talk about Andrew Johnson. We can talk about Horace Maynard. We can talk about Parson Brownlow. But what was the everyday experience like for civilians during the war? It is hard for us to think about it today, but we certainly saw a refugee crisis during the Civil War period in East Tennessee. We see this both in Eastern Tennessee and in the northwestern portions of North Carolina. So, to help students dig into that, we actually have the ability to dig into our sources at the museum. And some of those that you're going to see today are kept in our collections at the museum and within our archives. But it is difficult to locate those historical accounts by civilians, owing to educational opportunities in the area and also for perceptions of outsiders of the Appalachian region. It's really hard to get a lot of firsthand accounts from the moment from civilians who live there. So the question becomes, how might we find evidence of their experiences during the Civil War, particularly in the pivotal fall of 1862? And for those of you who may not be familiar with what's going on in the nation in 1862, 1862 is a pretty rough year for the United States in terms of the Civil War. In the fall, in East Tennessee, for example, we are going to see the Cumberland Gap fall out of Union control. It flip-flops throughout the war 4 times during the course. And in the fall of 1862, Union forces will be forced to retreat out of the area. So this actually provides a pretty good opportunity to go through some primary and secondary source exploration with students, since we're trying to find a particular perspective from the war. So this is a really good opportunity to help students think about what is a primary source, what is a secondary source, and how you can go about looking for information for one of those hard to find sources. So this is the approach we're taking with this particular topic. First, because there are basically in the Cumberland Gap region no firsthand written sources about the civilian experience at that time from people who are on the ground. We're going to look to our secondary sources to build a background. Look at books such as Lincolnites and Rebels. Look at other textbooks that talk about the Civil War experience in Eastern Tennessee. Some other primary sources that we have access to are some primary sources that come from outside of the geographic area. Particularly, we'll be looking to the papers of Horace Maynard's family, particularly his wife, Laura Maynard. They had a son who was serving at the Cumberland Gap as a soldier during the war and was in the area during that time period. And finally, what can we look to see about civilians? Well, while the civilians may not be writing, the soldiers who were located within the Cumberland Gap were doing a lot of writing about what was taking place in the area. And they're talking a lot too about what is happening to the civilians. And sometimes they're writing not directly about what's happening to the civilians, but we can infer things that are happening as a result. So let's begin by looking at a little bit of review with primary and secondary sources. This is probably something you're encountering with your students when you are working with them on sources, and it can be really hard to help your students understand the differences between primary and secondary sources. In addition to working at the university, I'm also an adjunct at LMU, teaching Civil War and classes on Abraham Lincoln's life. And even at that freshman, sophomore, junior levels, we still have a lot of confusion about what is the difference between our primary sources and our secondary sources. And the 3 primary groups of sources, or not primary, the 3 main groups of sources that we're going to be looking at in this session are going to be a book called Old Time Tazewell that was written by a resident by the name of Mary Hansard, except she wrote this book in the 1890s. at least 30 years after the end of the war. So she's recalling what she experienced in the area. Tazewell was and still is the county seat of Claiborne County, where the Cumberland Gap is located. So she had a lot of firsthand experience with what was going on in the Gap, especially since at the time she lived on the road between Tazewell and the Cumberland Gap, the town. Another thing we're going to look at is a letter from Laura Maynard, the wife of Horace Maynard, who is at that time living in Buffalo, New York. This is a letter that she writes to Abraham Lincoln in 1862. And the other sources we're going to be looking at is a set of letters by a gentleman named Harvey Durkee, who was from Ohio and who was stationed in the Cumberland Gap in 1862. One of the things we're going to be seeing with Harvey's letters is that his spelling and punctuation is not always the best, which your students may encounter when they look at primary sources, but we'll be working through that together too. I've also included our chart on primary versus secondary sources. And on the Padlet that you will gain access to after this session, we'll actually be putting some of our worksheets up that you can use to help your students both dig in to primary sources and evaluate them, and also to help them understand, are they looking at a primary source or are they looking at a secondary source? So for everyone here, you are familiar with primary sources. You know that primary sources come to us directly from the historical moment, that they are written and are giving an accounting as that event is happening or has just happened. That is the person on the ground. As I always say, calling them primary and secondary sources, that's just revealing degrees of separation from the event itself. Secondary sources, those come from individuals familiar with the moment and who rely on primary sources to reconstruct the event. Now, primary sources can include diaries, letters, newspaper articles, speeches, and other contemporary documents. And a lot of what we're looking at this week are letters. But then we have this tricky book that's going to be written by Mary Hansard in the 1890s too. And we're going to have to think about that as a group. And this is one of those moments where when we begin to talk about that, I hope you'll take yourself off the mic so that we can have conversations about how we would label that particular source. Secondary sources, these are often found in books, journal articles, and again, newspaper articles can go either way. Those sources are secondhand, often written by people who are using primary sources, primary accounts, to put down their understanding and analysis of that event. So some good examples of primary sources, we might look at Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, or we might look at a newspaper article dated November 20th, 1863, the day after Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. For our secondary, we might look to a scholar who wrote a 2019 journal article on Lincoln's speech or a book. But interestingly enough, and this is an area where we sometimes see our students struggling, sometimes they might encounter a newspaper article from 1909 that is about the Gettysburg Address. And your students might naturally want to say, oh, well, that's a primary source because it was written a long time ago and it's talking about the Gettysburg Address. But you see, we have to think as historians in 1909, people across the United States were celebrating the centennial of Abraham Lincoln's birth. So even though they might have been talking about the Gettysburg Address in 1909, what they are likely doing is they are looking at source material from 1863 and writing about it from their perspective of 1909. If we wanted to be writing about and looking at exactly how people in 1909 thought about the Gettysburg Address, then it would be a primary source. But it's one of those tricky things. And that's always worth going over with students, especially when we're looking at the Civil War, where we have a lot of memory studies and memory accounts connected with that event. Primary sources, as we know, help us understand how people reacted to an event in the moment. And secondary sources, well, those can help us place a historical event within the context of the past. So it's always good to be introducing our students to both types of sources in building their historical understanding. Now, were you to look at a variety of secondary sources, this would be what you would learn prior to looking at the primary sources that we are going to look at with one another. So, as I'm sure many people here know, Tennessee left the Union on June 8th, 1861. But in the county where the Cumberland Gap is located, Claiborne County residents voted at almost 89% to remain within the United States. The greater majority of people who lived there wanted to remain with the Union. Those who voted to secede, those were some of the larger landowners within the county. And in many cases, those were properties that also had enslaved individuals connected to them as well. So while a lot of power and money in the county were connected to remaining or to exiting with the southern states, the greater majority of the people who lived in the county wanted to remain with the Union. Now, no major battles would end up taking place in Claiborne County, even though the Cumberland Gap was there. And that seemed a bit odd to people at the time because there was really an expectation that a great invasion force was going to eventually come up from the south by Southern forces and go through the Cumberland Gap. It became a strategic key point for Union forces to hold the Cumberland Gap. Because they were expecting an invasion from that point. However, that invasion never came. Skirmishes between the two armies were common in the area, and with all the chaos that happens in the fall of 1862, and which we'll get further into with context, the town of Tazewell, the county seat, actually burned to the ground on November 11th, 1862. Now, one of the primary soldiers that we will be looking at in this set of letters was a man by the name of Harvey Durkee. He had been recruited into the Union Army early in the year in Ohio, and he was with Union Brigadier General George W. Morgan's men in Company A. 20,000 men were holding the Cumberland Gap at that time, right after Confederate forces under William Churchill had abandoned the gap in June 1862. Again, they're waiting for an invasion that does not come. They build lots of south-facing batteries in preparation for the attack. But a key point is that Confederate forces instead find a way of going around and through the gap. They take a much longer route and go into Kentucky. And unfortunately for Morgan and his men, that means that cuts off their supply lines, which means the men are bored, they are hungry, and they're starting to get a little bit desperate. They are located at the Cumberland Gap where there are a number of cave systems. While they're there, they have actually been making explosives in the cave, mining saltpeter and using bat guano to make explosives. And before they exit the area, in 1862 of October, Morgan and his men will actually explode their camp so that none of the resources can be used. And this retreat that occurs in October, I should note, was significant enough that it made front page news in many national newspapers, including the New York Times. It included soldier accounts of what had happened. Now, with taking that in mind, with context, if you know that the majority of the people who lived in Claiborne County supported the Union, and you know that soldiers have had their supply lines cut out, and I will turn this over to the audience, what types of traumas or difficulties do you think the local population might have faced as a result? And feel free to take yourself off mute, and then you can go back to mute if you'd like to respond.
Well, depending on the size of the army, of course, you got to feed that army, and they're probably going to depend, even if they bring stuff in from outside, they're going to depend on the local area for at least a limited number of supplies. So that's going to be an issue. Um, See, Suzanne says, soldiers looting, taking supplies from homes, malnutrition and fear. It's another comment that we see in the chat box.
Right. So keep those in mind. I want our deductions to be in place while we begin to go through the primary sources as well. So the very first source, and I'm going to turn it to you to whether we should be thinking about this as a primary or a secondary source, is Mary Hansard's account, Old Time Tazewell, which she wrote in the 1890s as an older woman, actually in her 90s herself. She says she doesn't give a long description within her book. She calls it a terrible time, that frightful time. She's very careful with that throughout her account. She doesn't like when she's talking about armies. She very rarely identifies whether she's talking about a Union army or a Confederate army. And you can kind of tell that that's done on purpose. But she notes in her account, and then the confusion that we were subjected to. Very often, the roads would be crowded every day with large regiments of men, perhaps for weeks. In cold wintry weather, our houses would be crowded also. Many times we were crowded out from our fires by the soldiers until we would nearly chill with cold. We couldn't blame them, for they were nearly frozen also. While they were in our house warming, others were killing our hogs and sheep, ducks, chickens, and loading their wagons with corn and hay and everything that they could find. They would soon leave, and perhaps others would come. So, looking at her accounts, we kind of see this backing up some of our suspicions that we've seen just by learning the context of what's taking place in the time period. We know that early fall, before we get to the point really where Mary's talking about the cold weather, even then, that there are possibly soldiers who are dipping into the supplies of the local population. Now, take that into your mind too. When individuals sometimes think about, and students think about civilians and soldiers during the war, they often think about soldiers taking away from the other side. If you'll recall what we learned in our context, Claiborne County's residents are largely in support of the Union. How do we think that soldiers might be doing this or justifying it? Do we think there might be any payment taking place? How would you address this with your students?
I wonder if there was promise of payment. Maybe not actual payment, but we'll get around to paying you guys.
It will come in due time.
Someone
sort of
asked the
thing.
questions,
Yeah.
might the Army feel that the civilians owed them support?
That's a good question too.
Yeah, and a lot of IOUs issued.
A lot of IOUs. Those are good questions to have in mind. All right. Another question I would ask here, how would you treat this as a source? This is an older lady who is writing 30 years after the event, but she's also relating what she experienced during the war. How would you label this? Primary? Secondary?
So someone says it might be secondary given the length of time that it had been since the war. I would say primary. although one that you would have to treat with a degree of skepticism, again, given the length of time since the events had taken place.
Yeah. It in the end, it depends on how you plan to use it as a source when you are writing about it. But by all accounts, this is from a lady who was present. And so it is a primary source in that it is her giving her recalling of memories. But memories are tricky things, and you do have to be careful when you're looking at what people say about memories. Um, Mary Hansard, for example, for more background on her piece, she had friends and family who fought on both sides of the war, and she tried very hard throughout her text to give equal care and concern to discussing about both sides of the armies. But she also, as we can see when we read her text, she's repeating a lot of words and phrases that go along with a lot of the lost cause imagery that begins to grow in popularity in the 1880s and the 1890s. So we can definitely see a balance there. From what we know about what actually occurred in Claiborne County, the people who were firmly in support of the Union stayed pretty firmly in support of the Union throughout, and the same for those who gave their loyalty to the Confederacy. We see a much more effort at the end of the war to actually, or 30 years after the war, to give balance to discussing those events and kind of equalizing both the sides. Because in the immediate aftermath and during the present, we actually see, like I said, a refugee crisis. There are a great number of people trying to move out of the area. There are extrajudicial hangings that are occurring in the area too, depending on support. There's also the kidnapping of individuals for to be conscripted into the Confederate Army in at least one instance. So some of those things are glossed over within her text, but it also could deal with her perspective, where she is coming from, where she viewed it at the time period. So we have her account, but it's very limited. It's very brief. So what else do we know about what's going on with these events? We have Laura Maynard, Mrs. Horace Maynard. We have one of her letters to Abraham Lincoln, and this is kept in the Abraham Lincoln papers at the Library of Congress. Laura Maynard was a wife to Horace Maynard, who was a leader who attempted to keep East Tennessee within the United States. Her sister-in-law was actually a teacher at Tazewell for students who were there. And what we see in her letter, she has retreated to Buffalo, New York. They lived at what we now think of as Union County, Tennessee. And if you go to Union County, Tennessee, you will see the middle school named after her husband there, taken for his efforts during the war. And in this letter, she writes, "Pardon me for intruding upon you when you are already overwhelmed with care and anxiety. But the brave, good men who went out from my home, East Tennessee, and have been struggling to free her from disloyal tyranny, the last 12 months are now in danger of being cut off at a blow. At Cumberland Gap, just within reach of their homes, shall they now be butchered or be made the menials of Mr. Jefferson Davis for the want of more men? Excuse me, sir, but let me entreat you to send a force into that country sufficient to save these honest, loyal men from so horrible a fate and to deliver East Tennessee from her present misery. Pardon my importunity, sir. Perhaps you have a son. I have one in that little army at Cumberland Gap, and many another mother's son is there. Shall they be saved? With great respect, Mrs. Horace Maynard." So, in reading this letter, what type of fears does Laura have about what is going to occur in the Claiborne County area should it fall under Confederate control?
Which talks about them being cut off, which I think is an interesting language to use.
Cut off is it's a specific choice of words. As I noted in another context piece, there had been a lot of extrajudicial hangings, particularly for spies. People had been accused of spies, whether they had actually been spying or not, but they had Union loyalties. A lot of that had occurred in Claiborne County.
So we also, Suzanne mentions, possibly being forced into service for the Confederacy. And then, yeah, other mentions about negative consequences for those who didn't support the Confederacy.
Yes. So at this same time, one event that we know occurred in the area, one of her fears actually did come through. When the Confederate Army arrives in October and had been there in June, they had brought wagons with them, and then had told the residents of Claiborne County to bring their wagons too, because they were going to go to Camp Wildcat in Kentucky to gather some salt that they had there that could be used for the population. But instead of taking them to get the salt, they conscripted the men in the army for a 6-month period, and they took the wagons to use in the war effort. And the men were finally released in the winter in Chattanooga. They were wearing late summer, early fall clothes and had to make do with that while they were in Chattanooga, which can get even cold there in the wintertime. And then were not prepared with those supplies too. So it was a fear that came to light. So we can see by building context with our secondary sources too, that these fears that women like Laura Maynard had are coming to light. How do we think that Laura Maynard has her information about Cumberland Gap, even though she's in New York, in Buffalo, New York? Where's that information coming from?
So someone says maybe her husband.
Possibly her husband. That is true. We do know that he had information networks on the ground and had been pretty good at gathering intelligence.
I would think her son maybe is writing too.
Yes. The great deal of her information is coming from her son. And not only her son, but some other young men who lived in the East Tennessee area, the women that she was friends with, they are receiving letters from their sons as well. And that is indicated within the end of her letter as well. So
someone else also mentioned something about newspapers and other reporting.
There are newspaper reports coming out of there. This is before the New York Times spread. The Cumberland Gap would feature in newspapers. They happened in Harper's Weekly. There's even some Godey's Ladies books where the area sometimes popped up and came in. There was an understanding that the Cumberland Gap was considered to be an invasion point and that it would be important to holding Kentucky and making certain that it didn't at least fall out of that border state status as well. So she is getting information, but the really hard on the ground information that she's getting, the fears from the local populace, those are coming from her son. And it must be said that the individuals who were stationed at the Cumberland Gap, even though their literacy levels in some cases were not the best, they wrote a lot. And why do we think that they were writing a lot? Anybody have any guesses as to that, for why they were writing so much? And this is one of those areas too where we can ask students to think back to that context. What do we know about their time spent in the Cumberland Gap?
So they were sitting around and waiting. So a lot of waiting for things to happen.
Yeah, they're sitting around and waiting. They actually get the fortresses, the sides, they get those put in pretty fast. and then it's just a waiting game. We know that in the Gap Tunnel that was, or not the Gap Tunnel, the Gap Cave that was nearby, that they did establish a hospital. And even though there were skirmishes, that hospital is mainly being used for traditional sickness and disease that's spreading at the time period from an army that is staying in camp for too long and is just getting disease. And so that's what its primary use as a hospital is being used for. And one of our best writers that we have at the Cumberland Gap is Harvey Durkee. Unfortunately, we don't have an image of Harvey Durkee, but we do have images of some of the other men who served with him while they were at the Cumberland Gap. And so he writes to his brother fairly often. And why is he writing to his brother? Well, one, a little bit of context. His brother's worried about him. Also, his brother's kind of worried that he's going to get drafted into the army at some point. And so Harvey's constantly writing to his brother and telling him how things are not as bad as all of that. Now, a couple of years ago, an entire set of Harvey Durkee's letters from the time that he enlisted in the army and to the time that he left the army were put up at auction and were sold. And there were a couple from the Cumberland Gap, but we have the majority of the Cumberland Gap letters. And in those letters, he writes about the locations that he sees, the type of drills that they're doing, his thoughts on the Emancipation Proclamation, his thoughts on politics. But that's not what his letters are about in the Cumberland Gap. His letters in the Cumberland Gap almost singularly focus on one thing. So let's take a look and see if we can figure out what that is, and then what that might tell us about how soldiers are affecting civilian lives at the time too. Now, Harvey is not our best speller or user of punctuation. So if you use these letters with your students, it can be a good English lesson exercise too, but you also may need to help them just a little bit, even with our transcriptions. So in early September, he writes to his brother and says, "We have moved from our old camp about 3 miles and got up on a hill in better position. It's not quite so handy to water, but I like the place very well. It is a little nearer to a good large cornfield, but as a matter of course, we don't have none, and then a roasting ear or two. I tell you what, old boy, such things have to suffer around these parts, or you would think so if it was your fields. A man's honesty does him but little good here in this country." So the writing is a little rough, but what do we think Harvey's telling his brother?
I think the end part of that is really interesting. A man's honesty does him but little good here in this country. It's talking about the cornfield that obviously did not belong to the army that they have now built a camp near.
Mm-hmm. And it's pretty clear they're eyeing that cornfield while they're there looking at it.
Yeah, someone mentions he sounds pretty hungry.
He does sound pretty hungry. Pay attention to that. It's going to be a running theme while we're in these letters. So he's focused on the cornfield, but he is talking about a man's honesty. Let's move to our next letter. "When I go out after apples or anything, it has to come or bleed the mercy of the seditious citizens. Does not go a great ways in Company A. Especially there has been from 50 to 100 hogs running around our camps, and now and then one would run into danger, or as you might say, fall into the pit, just as the case required. He was darn sure never to get out alive." Again, our theme continues. We're talking a lot about food. Apples, which can be picked in nearby orders. Here's a word your students may or may not know from your study of Civil War units. the word sessish. Does anyone know what a sessish would be?
A secessionist.
A
So someone who
secessionist.
supported the Confederacy.
Yes. Now, from what we know in context, from studying these documents, we know that really there aren't a lot of voting sessions members in Claiborne County. But remember what I told you too, who has the majority of land and crops and food in the county?
The large landowners.
Large landowners, the secessionists. What do we think he's telling his brother in this?
So someone asked if he was being a little sarcastic about, the pigs accidentally falling into, a pit, so that they, would need to be put out of their misery and then ate.
Yeah, that's exactly what he's talking about. So hogs ran wild and they just happened to be around their camps. And if they fell into a pit, well,
Now, I have questions about the part here we're talking about to bleed the mercy of the Sesh citizens. I don't really understand what he's saying there.
so in some cases, so to look at that piece again, when I go out after apples or anything, it has to come or bleed the mercy of the Sesha citizens does not go a great way in Company A. So they're not asking. So we're looking at primarily secessionist citizens in this context. Now they're not asking. And that's again, it's a little sarcasm. Harvey Durkee does enjoy his sarcasm. It's clear through his letters. And as we will see in his next letter. Yesterday, I shouldered a bag and started for some lucky man's peach orchard. And begosh, I found it. And of course, the folks were not at home. So we helped ourselves to what we wanted. If it was in a civilized country, it would be considered stealing. But we only take things, and that is not stealing, I'm sure. And today I've got nothing to do but lay in the tent and eat peaches and apples and tell stories and fart and so forth and so on. Anyway, to pass time, no matter how to us, the easier the better. So we have a bag of stolen Murphys beforehand for supper and plenty of apples and peaches to eat.
So he seems to contradict himself a little here because one minute he's saying, we're not stealing, we're just taking it, but then he refers to it as stolen.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a little bit of justification, we might say. And again, if he's found a lucky man's peach orchard, can he be completely certain that it's a secessionist or a unionist? Or is it just there?
Well, and if you're hungry enough, do you really care?
Exactly. If you are hungry enough, do you really care? It's not, as he says, a civilized country. This is war. And there were a lot of thoughts at that period, particularly that the people in the Appalachian Mountains were kind of backwards. That had been considered. They all seemed really poor, and they all seemed as if they were really ignorant and they couldn't read and write very well, although our poor Mr. Harvey Durkee definitely has his spelling and grammatical quirks as well. But what we see in all of his letters, even though in the rest of his letters during the war, he talks a lot about various things, about politics, he is really focused on food while he is in the Cumberland Gap region. What do we think that this means for our residents who live in Claiborne County? What are they experiencing? And keep in mind, let's go back to our context too. There are 20,000 men with Harvey Durkee.
So several people are talking that the residents are probably just as hungry, if not more so. And there are probably
Yes.
lots of food shortages.
Lots of food shortages. If you'll remember, there are under 2,000 registered voters or people who voted in that last election. We know from census information there are 1,100 enslaved individuals in Claiborne County. We know that there are another about 1,200 women and children in the area. So the population of Claiborne County as a whole, not just in the Cumberland Gap area, is about a quarter of what the entire army that is currently stationed in the Cumberland Gap is at. So we might think about how does that affect their food sources? They're all going to be hungry right now in this moment. It's fall. What typically happens in fall for farmers?
It's harvest time.
It's
You're
harvest
storing up.
time.
You're storing up to be able to make it through the winter.
What happens if someone eats all your corns and apples and peaches and hogs?
Have nothing saved up for the winter.
That's right. So even though we don't have the civilians to tell us what they're going through exactly, we can look for hints and deduce in our soldiers' letters what might be going on. Is there anything else we can deduce? We know what's happening in the current moment in the fall, and we've kind of hinted about what it means for the winter and coming. Is it just going to affect the civilians in the fall?
Well, Suzanne brings up a point about, if they're eating up all the corn, are they going to have seed corn and things to be able to replant in the spring? And how is that going to impact, the next year's crops?
Also very true. So it brings up what are the long-term effects of this army being cut off from its supplies in the fall of 1862?
I would also wonder, how much wood are they cutting? What are they doing to the local water sources? What's that long-term environmental impact going to be?
Now, that is an excellent question, and one I'm really glad you brought up. So the armies want to make certain that they have a good eye on what's coming towards them from the Kentucky side. Also at the pinnacle at the gap, you can see towards Virginia. They want to see what's coming from Virginia. They want to see what's coming from Kentucky. As a result, if you've been to the Cumberland Gap today, you probably think of it as a beautiful wooded area, but that forestation project only comes along with the development of the park because during the Civil War, we see the deforestation of the mountains where the army is located. They cut down the entire trees in the area, which means wood kindling and all of that is going to be much harder to come by. Any other observations?
So I wonder if it rained a lot during that time period, and again, if they've cut down all the trees, like again, what does that do for kind of runoff and like mud and it could all of a sudden it can be a really unpleasant place to be in.
That's very true. And from what we know from accounts of Claiborne County at the time period, anyways, the roads at the Cumberland Gap were kind of treacherous at any rate, even without the deforestation. So it's very likely that the wood became worse.
So there's some great images that that the Library of Congress has for like Knoxville and some of the other East Tennessee areas, so you can kind of get a sense of like what it looks like when again these areas that we think of as very wooded and have all of the trees cut down, because it is very different than how our students probably envision it now.
That's massively different from the way we would think. This is a soldier's drawing of the Cumberland Gap at the time period. And take a look at how it looks for how he's drawn it. You can see a few little scraggly trees, but he's made it pretty clear that even though there's some brush and scrub put in, he really didn't accentuate the types of trees that you might be used to seeing in the area before. And even if you look at the campus of Lincoln Memorial University, where we are located at today, and you look at the early 1920s, most of our students, when they look at images from the 1920s, they're kind of astounded and they said, "Where are all the trees?" They had never really recovered and been brought back until the National Park Service came and began a planting project. And it's why, if you go into the Cumberland Gap National Historical Park, if you look around, there really are not a huge amount of large trees. And that's because they had not been present for a long time. And that was owing to what was done during the Civil War. Does anyone have any questions about what we've looked at? I hope this is giving you some ideas for how you might dig into sources with your students, help them think about the civilian experience within East Tennessee, and learn how, even if you're looking at letters from soldiers from Ohio or a lady living in New York, it can still give and reveal information about what's happening in East Tennessee at the time period.
Natalie, will we make the PowerPoint available on the Padlet page?
Yes,
Because I
we will
think that
be.
having those sources available, I think folks can do some really interesting things with those and have some good discussion with students.
Yes, we will make certain that you have the full sources as well. I've pulled passages, so those will be going up. You'll have the PowerPoint that you can use. And if you would like, and I will show this to you quickly because I know we are running short on time. If I can get it to come up. Here we go. I'm going to show you another page.
Wait, we're not seeing your screen now.
Yes, I'm switching
Okay.
shots. So we'll have our PowerPoint there. You'll be able to click on the link. This is our Flipgrid page for the Abraham Lincoln Library and Museum. There you can find materials, 3D images that you can use to help you better understand the soldier's experience, such as our videos on an up-close look at Civil War ambulances, up-close look at Civil War drums, some recruitment posters, and some other things related to Abraham Lincoln's life that can help supplement your Civil War lessons. And it also comes with questions that you can use to probe young learners, middle school young learners, high school learners into thinking about the Civil War. Any other questions?
Well, that's some really great material to be able to share. So thank you for showing that to us, Natalie. Again, I think that we can definitely think about how to have some great conversations with students with those sources and really be able to kind of dig into Civil War and bring it, have a local flavor to it.
Absolutely.
So a couple things as we get ready to wrap up. Again, a reminder, we will get these added to the Padlet page. So again, you can access that here at this link or using this QR code. And again, we'll have that up and available for you here in the next day or so. And then for those of you participating with us live today, or if you are watching this recording later on, if you will fill out this form, this will help to get you your PD certificate so that we can document the time you spent with us today. And again, we do make PD credit available for both participating live and for watching our recordings. So again, know that you can fill that out and get credit for that. Certificates are sent out about once a week. So again, just know if you haven't gotten it in a week, let us know and we'll find out what's going on. But we do send this out about once every week. So next month, Actually, let me pull up real quick. We'll drop that link in the chat box. So give me just a second for those of you who are live. Or you don't have to type it in. I'll drop that in the chat box. This series will continue next month. Again, we do this on the second Tuesday of each month. And so next month is on November the 9th, and that will be with the East Tennessee Historical Society. And the topic is investigating history, museum escape room strategies for the classroom. So again, if you've not already signed up for that, you can feel free to go back to our registration page and you can register for that in any of our other sessions. So if there are no questions, we'll hang out here for just a few minutes, but I'll go ahead and stop our recording. Again, I want to thank everyone for joining us today.